My next guest is a senior editor from the Action Network headquarters. He's a co-host of ESPN Plus's I'll Take That Bet. He's certainly what you call a doer. He's a friend of the show. He's back for round two. He is one of the most downloaded and requested guests of 2017. His name is Chris Raybon. Chris, how are you doing today, my friend?
I am doing fantastic, man. What's up with you?
So
How's everything going?
good. So, I was going through some of the things you said last year. Boy, you called a lot of things. I love your strategy. I incorporated it a little bit last year. I'm incorporating it a lot this year. And I want to ask you about your strategy. You are a big believer in waiting on tight ends and waiting on QBs. Is that a fair assessment of your strategy?
Yeah, it is. And the reason for that is because, and this is applying obviously to kind of your traditional fantasy league where you're starting one quarterback and one tight end, but it really comes down to the opportunity cost. You have to realize your fallibility, which essentially means in the early rounds, you're not going to hit on all your picks. You could be the biggest expert. And I know now because now that I'm in the industry, I get to draft against a bunch of experts and we all whiff on early picks. It's just impossible when you talk about injuries and just things that are completely out of your control that you can't predict. Because running backs and wide receivers, you're starting multiple of each of them, and they're so valuable. And especially with running backs, there's a lot of scarcity involved. What you need to do is kind of load up on those positions to account for the fact that you're going to miss on a couple of those guys, or there are just going to be times when you don't want to play a certain guy. Like, for example, running backs are a lot of running backs, if you're not like a 3-down back, those guys are mostly gone by the second round of a normal fantasy draft. You're going to have to start taking guys that are kind of these early down guys, these 2-down guys, like maybe a Derrick Henry or a Darius Geis, or you're taking a guy that, might specialize a little more in pass catching, and we don't know how many carries he's going to get, like a Deion Lewis or somebody. So either way, there's going to be matchups where you don't want to play these guys. So you can't just go and draft a starting lineup and say, this is my starting lineup, because there's going to be plenty of weeks where that second running back, you might not want to play him, or that wide receiver, even your top wide receiver, going against Xavier Rhodes or somebody like that, or Patrick Peterson, you might want to sit that wide receiver. So you kind of want to really load up on the positions where the scarcity is, and then you can find a lot of value at quarterback and tight end because you only need one. So you have some kind of leeway if you're not risking a high pick on it to bail on that pick if you mess up and find something on the waiver wire. Maybe you can make a trade because you've stocked up on running back and receiver. You have depth. You have better trade chips. No one's really trying to trade for tight ends and quarterbacks to the same extent. So I'm really big on kind of my first 8 rounds are usually almost always 4 running backs, 4 wideouts, or 5, even 5 running backs, depending on the league, and 3 wideouts or something like that. And then I don't really start looking at quarterback and tight end till the double-digit rounds or not soon before that, if that early.
No, it's a very your philosophy. It's very. It makes sense because you're stockpiling. I mean, it's in a way. I hate to bring the Patriots up this early, but it's what the Patriots do. They go deep at every position. And I think you have to do that in fantasy sports. Like you said, you might be dependent on that second, third, and if the injury bug hits you, that fourth running back. And I got to tell you, I mean, some of the quarterbacks last year, Chris, and I was thinking about you, and damn you for this. My whole league listened to our interview, and they all used your strategy. They were taking players you talked about. You called Todd Gurley, by the way. We're going to get to that in a moment, but the quarterbacks, Chris, that were going later on, my God, Phillip Rivers, even Cam Newton fell like to the 16th round.
Man.
It was crazy. Some of the quarterbacks, Ben Roethlisberger always falls. So, yeah, it makes a lot of sense, your philosophy on that.
And when you think about it, I think a really good example of watching this play out in real life, you just brought up the Patriots, and I think another great example of that is the team that beat the Patriots in the Super Bowl, the Philadelphia Eagles. They essentially, Howie Roseman came back in there after Chip Kelly kind of got a little too fancy with the roster and didn't really do too good of a job. And, he came back in there and he built depth. So at first, you kind of looked at the Eagles to start the season and you said, this is a solid team. And they got some pieces on the D line. They got a good O line, but you kind of questioned exactly how far they could go. And then as the season progressed, you started to see where they had a lot of depth at pretty much every position, including the quarterback position. And that was key because look at it this way. Carson Wentz still on his rookie deal. That's like drafting a late round quarterback in fantasy. It's like, sure, you could pay Aaron Rodgers or Matthew Stafford or all these guys the big bucks, but that just makes it harder to build a roster around them. It's not that you can't win that way. It makes it harder. So the Eagles had Carson Wentz on a rookie deal. That's like essentially taking a late round quarterback and he paid off. And look what they were able to do. Even when he went down, because he was on a rookie deal, they had enough money to have still got a quality backup in Nick Foles. They were able to kind of bolster the receiving depth. Alshon Jeffrey came up big down the stretch, even though he struggled a little bit during the regular season in his efficiency from down to down. You had a lot of guys kind of on the defensive line that could kind of rotate in and out. You had reinforcements on the O-line. Running backs, they didn't need Jay Ajayi, but he came up big in the playoffs. They didn't need him. They had LeGarrette Blount. They had Corey Clement, who was very good. But because they had all this depth, they were able to kind of roll with the punches whenever something happened that was kind of bad luck. And that's going to happen in the NFL more so than pretty much any other sport. You're going to have bad luck. Somebody's going to tear their ACL or blow out their Achilles or, pull a hamstring at the wrong time and miss a couple of weeks. It's going to happen. And so you have to just kind of prepare for that rather than trying to draft a perfect team and say, well, if my team stays healthy and if all this happens, then I'll win. Well, no, because there's a really low chance of all that happening. So you have to take a different approach.
No, that's well said. And one of your big philosophies is taking good players on good teams. You still stand behind that too, Chris, right?
Definitely. I mean, the bottom line is the better the team is, the more they're going to be able to stay on the field, especially on third down. I think, when you look at kind of third down percentages in terms of conversion from year to year, it's not necessarily a high correlation, but just knowing the kind of quarterbacks and teams that are going to be able to sustain drives, that's going to add to the fantasy volume. And volume is, you're really concerned with volume as a fantasy player. If your guy is not getting touches, targets, whatever, he's not going to score points. So when you have teams with decent offensive lines where they're not going to collapse if they get into a third and medium and third and long, it's going to be an automatic punt. Or teams that have quarterbacks that have some mobility, that can kind of create plays, teams that are well coached. Like look at the Rams. I mean, Jared Goff is not an all-world quarterback. He's a solid quarterback. He was drafted where he was, number 1 overall for a reason. But the bottom line is a lot of what happened last year was more due to the players they brought in on the O-line, Andrew Whitworth, and they kind of solidified that line, and they had really good play calling and some really good pieces around Goff that they utilized perfectly, and they kind of let Todd Gurley's talent shine through. They played to their strength. They didn't make Jared Goff win games for them. They just put him in position to win. And I'm not saying he's a game manager. I'm just saying he was a quarterback that was just in year 2 and had a really bad first year that you almost have to throw out because it was under such horrible circumstances. When you talk about Jeff Fisher and his whole regime and just kind of the ineptitude that they became common in his last few years of coaching with the Rams. So you really have to kind of look at the quality of the overall team. Because if you look at a lot of the early round busts in fantasy, especially at the running back position, a lot of times what you see happening is you see a bad offensive line, a bad quarterback, or just a bad team where the game script is not giving these guys a chance. I mean, a guy that I liked going into last year, which in hindsight was foolish, was Isaiah Crowell. I guess I was subjected to a little bit of recency bias, which is something we have to always look out for. And, he was coming off the good season, even on a bad team. And I said, okay, he could do it again. But what happened? They went 0-16 and he did not do it again. Those big plays dried up. The offensive line wasn't quite as good. They had some injuries. So you kind of got to make sure that, in the early rounds anyway, in the later rounds, you're just trying to find value. I mean, late in 2018, I'll draft the Buffalo Bill. I'll draft Charles Clay. I'll draft Kelvin Benjamin because those guys are values. I'm not risking much, but early on, you really kind of have to pay attention to the team quality. And later on, too, you might find a discount that way. I remember drafting Cooper Kupp in a lot of leagues just as like a throwaway last round pick. And, something like that paid off because I thought the Rams would be a good offense. So, team quality is definitely something to think about, just context in general, in every area of life, not fantasy or, whatever else. Yeah,
and one of the two of the guys you liked last year during our interview that you mentioned were Adam Gase, and you liked Sean McVay as well. And I think they both had good years last year.
I don't know. Adam Gase, that's tough. Like he kind of let me down a little bit. Like I started to sour on him when I thought it was really impressive what he did with that team the first year he was there. But he kind of went the whole culture over talent route. It seems to me this year, and I admire him for having kind of the guts to do that, because that kind of puts your job even more on the line than it already is. I think depending on what bookmaker you look at, I saw one book's odds where he was the second most likely coach to get fired first. In another book, he was the fifth most likely. But I think the fact that he kind of couldn't can make it work with some of these guys is still troubling. Like I know Ndamukong Suh can be a problem. I know I don't really know what was going on with Jarvis Landry or Jay Ajayi, but the bottom line is these are good players. Ajayi went to Eagles and was a key contributor for them in their Super Bowl run. And Ndamukong Suh is always one of the best interior linemen in the game, can generate a pass rush or stuff to run. And Jarvis Landry, can kind of gobble up targets underneath, get open quickly. Better outside receiver than I think some people give him credit for. And last year really stepped it up in the red zone. So, a lot of times it comes down to you also got to make it work. This is stuff we can't really measure in numbers or anything like that. And you just kind of have to watch out for it. And I'm not sure. I'm kind of skeptical to see, I'm not writing him off because you can't take away what he did in 2016. But this is kind of a big risk this year for the Dolphins. And I think he has to kind of, if it doesn't go well, I don't know if we see him there in 2019.
Yeah, and they basically just gave away Jay Ajayi. I mean, there was a fourth round pick. I mean, they just gave him away, I thought, and that's a steal for the Eagles, right?
Yeah, I mean, I like Ajayi a lot in fantasy this year, and one of the reasons is because I think the Eagles will continue to be a good team. And the second reason, they have Pro Football Focus's number one ranked offensive line heading into the season. I think that's a big positive. I know, Corey Clement is still there, so it's kind of more of a three-way committee than a two-way. But this is a team that, if you look at what they did last year, they weren't like a pass-heavy team or anything. Their running backs were very involved, and I think that's another thing you have to look at nowadays because, like I said, outside of the first round, you're really not getting a solidified three-down back in fantasy. And so a lot of these teams, they're going to incorporate at least two backs. So now you have to look at, okay, is this team going to run a lot of their offense through their running backs either by design or just because of game script reasons? And I think the Eagles do both. I think they like to run offense through their running backs just because it's a very efficient way of running offense if you look at the numbers, but also because I think they'll be a pretty good team. They have a good defense and they have a good offensive line. So I don't think they'll be down big in games to the point where they'll have to abandon the run. And therefore, I think they can kind of, even if Ajayi is, getting like 50, 60% of the workload, I think that's still good enough to kind of get him to like 15 to 20 touches that you need from your fantasy back to kind of have those RB1 numbers.
Are you a buyer, Chris, on any rookie quarterback this year?
I'll buy Lamar Jackson because he's still super cheap and he could kind of change. He could change things in leagues if he kind of has the similar success that some other mobile quarterbacks have had early on in their careers, where even if they're not necessarily the most polished passes, just what they're adding on the ground with that rushing ability, a lot of times can elevate, even maybe an average or a below average passer into a very startable quarterback, at least in good matchups. Because I think we talked about this last year, but pretty much every quarterback is going to be matchup dependent on this point. I mean, even you look at a guy like Aaron Rodgers, and you look at his numbers without Jordy Nelson, and his yards per attempt is a lot lower. His yards per game is under 250 over these last few years. And so even a guy like that, you might not want to start. Like, you don't want to start Aaron Rodgers on the road in Minnesota, do you? You know what I mean? And there's a lot of games. Like, I mean, do you really want to start any quarterback on the road in Minnesota against the Rams on the road with that defense that they got now, against the Chargers on the road with that defense? I mean, there's a lot of teams, Jaguars, there's a lot of good defenses that you're gonna want to kind of play the matchups with these quarterbacks and these running backs as well. And so, I'll buy on almost any kind of rookie quarterback with that kind of upside. But I think Lamar Jackson is a guy that stands out. And then he's not a rookie, but another guy that you could get for free that I think people might be a little turned off by because there's a rookie behind him. But Tyrod Taylor, the Browns have seemed really committed to him, and this is going to be the best supporting cast he's ever had. He's been a QB1 in 2 of his 3 years starting in Buffalo. The only year he didn't was last year when, there was a lot of things going on in Buffalo last year. I mean, their receiving core was terrible. Even after they got Kelvin Benjamin, he was kind of hampered by an injury, and he was even slower than he normally is. So it was bad, but you kind of put him with Josh Gordon and Jarvis Landry and Duke Johnson and David Njoku, second-year tight end. That's when tight ends usually take a leap. And you've suddenly got a lot of options for Tyrod Taylor to kind of get guys to pick up yards for him after the catch. And we know he can throw the deep ball as well. So and rush. So I think, as long as he's starting, he may end up being that, like, one of those guys, those fringe QB1s that, like, you look up and all of a sudden he's ranked 10th in points per game or something like that.
I could see that. And I had to ask you, because I know you're a huge Giants fan, Saquon Barkley. I mean, is he the real deal?
It looks like the real deal to me, man. I mean, if he didn't go ham in year one, I would be surprised. I mean, the Giants do have a tough schedule. I think that's the only thing, but the fact that he can catch the ball as well as he can, especially at his size, I think that from a statistical standpoint, unless he gets hurt, that he's gonna play really well. Jeff Schwartz, colleague of mine at the Action Network, he actually wrote an article talking about how Pat Shurmur kind of brought in some new offensive linemen, that little bigger guys. They got Nate Solder, they drafted Hernandez, guys that are a little bigger and can kind of run the same zone scheme that Barkley was running at Penn State. And Barkley didn't have the greatest O-line at Penn State, let's not forget. So I think it's a really good situation for him. And the more they throw to him, honestly, the better, because a good friend of mine in the industry, Warren Sharp, really has a really great website. All you guys should go check it out. A really sharp guy, great tweets and everything. But he talked about how he did research to find that anytime a running back takes a handoff and he's running into the offensive line, he's running up the middle between the tackles, he puts himself at a much greater risk for injury than when he's getting a reception and he's out in the open space and there's really only probably one guy or two guys that he has to make miss. The injury risk goes way down. So anytime you can have a running back that can catch the ball, that you can kind of throw to, and you don't always have to hand him, 300 carries, ramming him into the offensive line, for 25 times a game. Obviously he can do that, but anytime you could kind of conserve him by maybe throwing him a couple quick screens, little outlet passes or whatnot, and he picks up 5 yards that way, it kind of saves him from injury. So I like the fact that he's a really good pass catcher.
Yeah, well said. Who are some other guys you like this year, Chris?
Oh man, you want like early round guys? Or you want more like the late round sleeper type of guys?
Well, who pops into your head? Yeah, I mean that's a fair question. I really probably should have made it a little more.
There's a lot of rounds in the draft, man.
Yeah. So I mean, not so much sleepers, but who? Like when you picture the season, like who are guys that you're like, this guy I gotta have. Like if this guy's around, I'm gonna take him. So let's just say early to mid in that kind of.
Right. Well, I'm really high on the 49ers offense as long as Jimmy Garoppolo is starting. So Jimmy Garoppolo is, his ADP is climbing up there now. Sometimes he goes before I want to take a quarterback, and so I don't get him. But anytime that I'm in a draft which actually is to my benefit, because a lot of experts and hardcore guys are kind of embrace the late round quarterback strategy as well, as they should. But that also means that I can kind of get Jimmy Garoppolo in a double digit round like I want to. So I've been loading up on him. I think it was really impressive what he did last year, coming in mid-season, only a few weeks to learn the playbook, getting thrown in the fire and taking a 1-10 team and going 5-0, beating the Jacksonville Jaguars, putting up over 40 on them. They went to the AFC Championship game and had a lead in the second half. Beat the Tennessee Titans, another team that went to the second round of the playoffs. Just really, really impressive what he did. And with limited weapons, with no Pierre Garcon, with Carlos Hyde, who's a really poor receiver, has been throughout his career, thrown a fullback as tied for his second most targets in those 5 starts, and he still threw for over 300 yards a game. So really impressed with him. So I've been loading up on all the 49ers, whether it's Jimmy, McKinnon, probably a little higher on him than most, Pierre Garcon, higher on him than most. Even more, I don't think Marquise Goodwin is going to fall off as much as people think. I think Kyle Shanahan is really good at designing ways to get him open, because he does have that quickness and that speed for where if you have a good play caller that knows how to get guys in space, Goodwin can run the routes to make that happen. We kind of saw that down the stretch as well. So George Kittle was second in PPR points per snap in Garoppolo's 5 starts. So a lot of the 49ers are guys I'm loading up on. Patrick Mahomes and KC, I just think the supporting cast is too good for him to fail, especially in fantasy anyway, especially when you factor in his the fact that he can run a little bit. So that kind of adds to his floor and to his ceiling. I like the rookie in Baltimore for a cheap tight end, Hayden Hurst, 25-year-old NFL-ready guy. They had Ben Watson, up there kind of leading the team in receptions last year. Dennis Pitta the year before. Joe Flacco loves to throw to those tight ends. I know they got a bunch of new receivers, but I think they drafted Hurst in the first round to use him in that same kind of role right away. I think he has a dark horse shot to lead them in targets. Who else? Tyrell Williams of the Chargers, wide receiver. I mean, even if Antonio Gates, comes back, which they're talking about he might, we know Antonio Gates is not really a volume guy at this stage of his career. Mike Williams really, I don't know if it was the injury or what, but he didn't look like he really had it together, that he could move particularly well when he played last year. So I think Tyrell Williams has the inside track, at least as camp opens, as it stands right now. I think Tyrell has the inside track to be the second most targeted player on the LA Chargers. And when you talk about Phillip Rivers at quarterback, I think that's a really valuable position to be in. Lamar Miller is a guy a little earlier that I think I'm higher on than most, just because, he's been kind of falling out of the top 25 running backs in certain circles. But I think people are a little worried that over the last couple of weeks of the season, Alfred Blue out-carried him. I think it was 46-27. But if you look at it, Bill O'Brien, and this is when it's important to kind of pay attention to context and to the coaches. And it's not always numbers. It's more, sometimes it's quotes and what coaches are saying. They lie a lot, but sometimes you can glean insight from what they say. And I remember Bill O'Brien talking before the season about how he wanted to kind of alleviate Miller's workload a little bit, but he didn't really do that until the team was really kind of out of it. In those last 2 games, they were out of it. So, there was no use kind of running Miller into the ground anymore. So he gave some other guys some work. I don't think that was reflective necessarily of Miller as much. Their offensive line is not very good, but you're talking about a guy on a team with the easiest schedule. If you look at the Vegas win totals and you total them up for every team's strength of schedule, Texans have the easiest schedule in the league. They're getting Deshaun Watson back. They still have Hopkins. Bill O'Brien went 9-7 with Fitzpatrick, with Hoyer, with Osweiler. Three different seasons he went 9-7. I think this is going to be a good team, and you want running backs on good teams. And Miller's also a guy that, especially with Dante Foreman not looking like he'll be ready for week 1, is a guy that could be that 3-down back that you can get a little cheaper. So those are some of the guys.
Yeah, man, that's great insight. I had a couple questions on some of the things you were saying. Any chance that the league figures Jimmy G out? Any chance that they make adjustments on him?
I think sure, but that's true for any and every quarterback. The whole, it's an adjustments league. The league is constantly making adjustments. Teams make adjustments from the first half to the second half.
True.
I think when you look at Jimmy G, it's just you have to take it into context. And first, this guy's never lost a start. On the Patriots, obviously that was, that's fine. A couple of starts, he didn't lose. That's no surprise. But when you come to a 1-10 team and you beat quality playoff teams along the way, and you're putting up 300 yards a game, throwing to guys that were, Marquise Goodwin was essentially like a cast off of a team that needed receivers in the Buffalo Bills. Kyle Juszczyk is a fullback. Kendrick Byrne was he's an undrafted guy. Kittle, 5th rounder. Trent Taylor, 5th rounder. These are not, he put up numbers with a very kind of underwhelming supporting cast, which should improve. Kyle Shanahan is a really good coach, and that's another reason I'm behind it. We saw Matt Ryan really struggle in year 1 under Kyle Shanahan, and then Jimmy Garoppolo comes into a situation with less time to learn the playbook with a much worse supporting cast, and he crushes in year 1 with Shanahan. So I like his upside and the whole team's upside for year 2, especially because they incrementally improved the defense to where, I'm not saying Richard Sherman is still what he was in his prime, but he's going to be an upgrade on Dante Johnson. Reuben Foster only getting a 2-game suspension is a good look because he's a really impact player. And then they have a lot of other young guys that could still improve along that defense. They have they have some guys in the secondary when you talk about Jaquiski Tart. So I think it'll be a good team.
No, that's well said. And, there's certain teams, and we've had this conversation before, like if I have a player on Baltimore, I always feel like I'm punting that position. Like, Hayden Hurst is a great player. You're right, big tight end, big guy. Buffalo is almost like the same way. Outside of AJ Green, Cincinnati's kind of like that. What's your take on that? I mean, should you be concerned? I mean, but you're right. I mean, it depends where you take a player. Hayden Hurst late in the draft, I get it. But do you feel the same way? Are you like, ugh, I got so and so from one of those teams or another team that I haven't mentioned? You ever feel like that, Chris?
I mean, you always, when you have a team like Buffalo, I think you're always going to feel like that because, I mean, things could go really bad, especially if LaShawn McCoy is not going to be out there. But it's, again, you kind of hit it. It's all about the value. So in the early rounds, yeah, if I'm taking a running back on a team that I think is going to be abysmal, then I'd be worried. But if I'm getting that same player in the 8th or 9th or 10th round, it's a totally different situation because really the first few rounds are really the only place you're getting any type of floor you can depend on. And then once you kind of go through the middle and the end of the draft, you're kind of having to shift more to high ceilings and guys that you hope are going to hit. And that's why you want to kind of stock up on depth a little bit at the positions you're going to need to start multiple players, is because not everyone's going to hit, but you're just looking for a couple of those guys to hit. And so, it just all depends on value. If Kelvin Benjamin's going in like the 6th round because, hey, he's a number one receiver on a team, then it's like, I'll stay away. But if I'm getting him in the 10th or 11th, now it's like I could get a guy who might get 120 targets. So, in the 11th round. So that's a whole different scenario. So it's all about the value. Like Hayden Hurst, again, most people don't draft him. He goes undrafted. So I could conceivably draft my defense and kicker and still get Hayden Hurst and wait on tight end the whole draft. So it's all about the value.
Yeah, and I loved your last year. You talked about Brandon Cooks' floor, and boy, were you dead on with that. When he goes off, he's great. But his floor is just horrendous. Are you buying this Mitch Trubisky? Yeah, are you buying the hype on him?
I'm cautiously optimistic. I think Matt Nagy did a lot of good things in Kansas City. I think he learned from Andy Reid, who's a good person to learn from when you talk about schemes and play design and whatnot. And if you look back at a lot of other quarterbacks who put up poor numbers in year one, a lot of them, or just not necessarily always poor numbers, but just kind of mediocre numbers at best. They made a lot of these guys recently that were early first round picks, made big jumps in year two. You look back to Marcus Mariota, second year in the league, had a 26-9 touchdown interception ratio. You look at Jared Goff, of course, in a similar situation. I think that's what everyone's kind of looking at with Nagy and Trubisky. But Goff, Blake Bortles threw 35 touchdowns in year two. So there's been a lot. Ryan Tannehill improved a lot in year two statistically. So, I'm cautiously optimistic. I think last year he had probably the worst coach he could have, probably had the worst supporting cast he could have when you talk about, Dontrell Inman and Kendall Wright and Josh Bellamy and Marcus Wheaton. They didn't really have much at all for him to throw to. And now they got some pieces. They got Allen Robinson. They got a guy with some speed in Taylor Gabriel. They got Trey Burton, a really athletic kind of tight end that could catch the ball. They drafted Anthony Miller, who's a really good player. We'll see how fast he developed, but at least he drew some comparisons to Antonio Brown. Obviously not to the same quality of Antonio Brown, but kind of the way he plays the game and the things he can do. So they definitely have there's a lot of upside there with Trubisky. We just have to see, how he executes it and if he can execute it as well. I don't think the supporting cast is as good as, like, for example, the Rams last year. I don't think they don't have like a Todd Gurley or, it still remains to be seen how good Allen Robinson is coming off a really bad season and then tearing his ACL. But there's definitely a lot of reasons for optimism with Mitch Trubisky.
Yeah, and there's a lot of guys that people like. We talked about that a little bit. Are there any guys that you kind of hear a lot about, but in your mind, Chris, it's a red flag? Are there any red flag guys that you're like, nah, I'm all set with that guy?
It's more so comes down to value and where they're being drafted, though. So, like, for example, Dalvin Cook is a guy I really like as a player, and I loved what he did last year, but a lot of times I see him going in the top 10 running backs as if he's not coming off ACL surgery, And my colleague Jonathan Bales, actually the co-founder of Fantasy Labs, he did research a few years ago that showed that first year back from an ACL tear, running backs on average lose about 30% of their production. So I think that's something that it has to be factored in. I always try to look at the range of outcomes. So Cook's ceiling is still intact. It's what he did last year, with the amount of volume that he got. But his floor, I think, is maybe a little bit lower than people realize, either from him being hampered by the injury itself or simply from the team maybe lightening his workload a little. Because remember, when he was getting a huge workload, Latavius Murray was still kind of banged up, coming off an ankle injury, I believe it was. And so down the stretch, you saw Jerick McKinnon kind of getting, kind of in that 15-touch range, but you also saw Murray in that 15-touch range. And so they could easily kind of slot Cook into more of that McKinnon role and still let Murray kind of operate as the banger, early down guy, maybe clock killer or something like that. So I think that might not be factored in as much to his to his ADP. And so I don't really get Dalvin Cook on my teams because I kind of want him as an RB2, kind of a high upside guy. I don't want necessarily to depend on him as an RB1. And then a lot of the early quarterbacks I'm kind of staying away from because, again, I just don't like taking quarterbacks that early. I don't think you can do it if you really know your stuff, because you're always going to be able to find, the better you are at drafting, the more value you can find at those other positions late. But I still don't really like it. I don't feel particularly good about any of the top quarterbacks in terms of, even though I have them ranked, 1 through 4 or 5, it's like, Aaron Rodgers doesn't have Jordy Nelson. His numbers have been a lot lower without Jordy Nelson. If he has another injury to his wide receiving core, then it's like, who knows? He's also missed half or 2 of the last 5 years with a collarbone. Russell Wilson going to a coordinator now that really wants to run the ball. Receiving core kind of got gutted a little. Deshaun Watson, love him, but easier schedule means not as many shootouts. Don't know what he'll be like coming off the ACL. Cam Newton getting a new coordinator in Norv Turner. So there are a lot of these guys that are high up. They have like really good projections, but it's just like, I just feel like it's early to kind of take them because I don't really feel confident that this is like a slam dunk pick as opposed to just waiting and getting a guy for really good value in the double-digit rounds.
Yeah, that should be interesting. Norv Turner and Cam Newton. Norv Turner's never really had a guy like Cam Newton. I mean, he's had, Aikman. He's had Phillip Rivers. He's never had a guy like Cam Newton. And I don't think there is a guy like Cam Newton. Is there a lottery ticket pick that you really are confident in? A home run pick, I guess, that you think I could cash in?
Like a late round lottery
just
ticket?
A guy that... Yeah, I love your premise today of value because it's so true. I mean, it's all about value. But is there a guy that maybe people might overlook that's going to be that you like late, man? You really like this guy. People are ignoring him. They're not giving him the credit he deserves.
I mean, beyond the guys I already mentioned, let me think. I would say it's a lot of the guys I already mentioned. Like right. Tyrell Williams is a good example. Like he kind of has that inside track to the number 2 receiver job. And Keenan Allen has missed a ton of time over these past few years. So you also might be like an injury away from Tyrell Williams being the number 1. So, I mean, there obviously is some floor there. He could also, maybe he does get past. Maybe Mike Williams puts it together. Who knows? I mean, it didn't look likely, but it could happen. I'm not going to rule it out. But I think for the value you can get him, he doesn't go drafted a lot of times. I really do like him. I think Chris Godwin, that's one we didn't talk about. In Tampa Bay, they were talking him up all offseason as like he kind of deserved the right to start. The coaches were saying over in 2 wide sets, and I think he probably will. And Deshaun Jackson, you'll see him more in 3 wide sets because Godwin is a bigger guy. He'll provide more as a blocker, but he was also just better than Deshaun last year. Deshaun posted career lows in yards per catch, yards per game. I think he might be, he's over 30. He might be slowing down just a little bit. And Godwin is a guy that's kind of really on the rise. So I think he's a really interesting pick that could end up kind of being a number 2 receiver that gets a lot of these deep targets and red zone targets and things that we look for a really cheap price in fantasy drafts. And I got one for you. Here's a lottery ticket. I almost forgot. Cole Beasley. He was completely like a bust last year. But the year before, he caught 75 passes. And last year, because Dallas kind of had the situation where they had Dez, can't really move the way he used to. Jason Witten, very slow at that stage of his career. And Terrence Williams, kind of a one-trick pony guy that's not really going to mix it up too much in terms of his route running, kind of just going to clear out a lot of the time. I don't think he didn't catch a touchdown last year. So a lot of teams, when Beasley was on the field, they could kind of focus on him and take him out. And so this year they're lining him up in more places. They're giving him some work on the outside. And they kind of really looked at their receiving core now that they have no Dez and they have no Witten, and they're looking and saying, hey, this is a guy who caught 75 balls, led us in receiving 2 years ago. We got to get this guy involved as kind of an outlet for Dak Prescott, as an efficient guy that can move the chains and keep us on schedule with all these new receivers kind of mixing in. So I think you'll see a rebound season from Cole Beasley. He's another guy that usually doesn't get drafted.
Yeah, all sound picks. Chris, let me ask you a question. How could Dez just fall off the map? Like, you're telling me that he couldn't help anybody? Has he gotten that bad?
I mean, well, part of it is that he just wants more money than teams think he's worth. So I don't think he's necessarily, like, I've joked about it a lot, but, I don't necessarily think he's, like, done. I just think he's a far cry from what he used to be, to the point where he's probably at best a league average player at this point, a league average like number 2 at this point at best. But the problem is he still sees himself as more like a 1. And so he kind of wants that kind of money or something, akin to it, even if it's on a 1-year deal or something. And he might not get it. Or if he does, it might take a couple injuries or a couple dominoes to fall. But if you look at it, what's really happened in this league is that it's a combination of things. It's number one, that you've had since about 2010-11, you've had these rule changes that have made it easier for little guys to get open, because you as a defensive back, you're not allowed to do as much as far as, with your hands and moving guys off their spots and stuff like that at the line of scrimmage. And so these little guys are getting cleaner releases, and they're able to win quickly and get open, with lateral movement in space. And at the same time, you have bigger guys that, like a Dez Bryant, those body types don't really age well. And so in the NFL now, it's really more about that agility and that side-to-side movement, rather than just being a big guy who can run faster than most other big guys, which Dez can't anymore, but I mean, that's what he was in his prime. And so, these guys, their bodies kind of age poorly. And now you have guys that, when Dez, for example, think of a slant, think of an in cut, like a in route or an out route, like that's a big guy now that has to make that like really sharp cut. And once you start getting up there in age and you lose a step or two and you weigh that much at that size and at that height, you don't really have the same kind of leverage as like a guy that's a little lower to the ground and a little shiftier. And therefore you can't run your routes as effectively, and cornerbacks can kind of stay on you even if they're smaller than you. And so that's what's happening to a lot of guys. I mean, you kind of saw it happen with Brandon Marshall. We saw it happen with Andre Johnson. We've seen it happen with Jordy Nelson. Michael Crabtree, even to a certain extent, hasn't really, he's caught a lot of touchdowns, but that kind of masks the fact that he hasn't really been an efficient player on a down-to-down basis. I believe he has the lowest yards per target over the last 3 years of among receivers. I forget the amount of targets, but I think it's like 100 or so. But so a lot of these bigger guys, the game doesn't suit them as much as it did in the past, where they were kind of just teams weren't using shotgun and spread as much. They were just isolating these big guys, one-on-one. And if the safety kind of came down or didn't get to that side of the field, you had a one-on-one matchup with this big guy who could run a little faster than he should be able to, and just you could kind of throw it up to him. And now that's not really as efficient. You just kind of want to take that shifty guy maybe in the slot or something like that for a shorter gain that's going to be more efficient.
Yeah, well said, Chris. We've talked about value today. We've talked about team quality, coach quality. This is probably more of a real life thing than a fantasy thing.
Sure.
James Harrison was on the other day talking about, he didn't blast Mike Tomlin. I personally think Mike Tomlin's maybe the most overrated coach in the league. He's got some special players. I'm not saying he's one of those guys where you keep away from him because he's going to hold his players back. That's not it at all. I mean, Pittsburgh has too many superstars on it. Mike Tomlin, is he overrated, Chris?
I don't think so. I think that. I mean, what did James say first? Let's start
Well,
with that.
he was comparing him to Belichick, and his implication on Tomlin was that he does not treat everyone the same. He's a coach's player in a sense that he's one of the guys. He doesn't command the respect that Belichick does. He didn't say a specific name, but he's clearly saying that he treats Antonio Brown differently than he does the rest of the team, or he treats Bell differently than he does the rest of the team. Maybe that he doesn't have enough respect. He doesn't have enough command of the locker room. His treatment of players, whereas Belichick has all of that, and the results tend to be a little. That's what kind of the road he was going down.
Okay, I see what you're saying now. I think you can make that argument because, I go back and forth on it because it's hard to say without really being in the locker room. But what I see from Tomlin is I get the vibe that he's kind of. He doesn't seem like he kind of seems like he's a player sometimes. Like he is one of the guys, but at the same time, it's like if you're treating guys like Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell a little differently, I mean, those guys you forget that, they're the most talented players in the league, arguably at their position, especially Antonio. But you forget that these guys put in the work. Like Antonio Brown wasn't always this good. Like he put in work to get this good. Le'Veon Bell, when he came out of school, was like a big, almost plotting type. And now he's like this lean guy that can catch you, 80, 90 balls in a season, created a whole new kind of running style that we didn't really kind of see before to that level with the kind of patience that he displays. So like, I could understand why a coach would kind of be partial to guys that put in the work and then achieve it, because it's a great example to the rest of the team that, hey, this is what happens when, like Jadakiss said, hard work beats talent if talent don't work hard. So, if you have the talent and you work hard, you're gonna get to some high levels. So I understand that, but at the same time, I think there are kind of things that you see with the Steelers that have happened repeatedly over the years that do make you question just how much Tomlin, is doing to kind of help them, perhaps mentally. In certain situations, like I know a lot of people, especially Steeler fans, will be familiar with every year, it seems like at least once, maybe even more than that, they just blow a road game that they're not supposed to blow. And I know a lot of teams lose games on the road, but I mean, the Steelers, I think last year it was the Colts. One year it was like the Jets who were had one win at the time. I mean, Miami, I think a couple, they just have these stinkers. They have drastic home road splits. And anytime you see a team like that, it's like you do have to kind of question the head coach a little bit. So I do think Mike Tomlin has to be a little bit accountable for that. I mean, Ben Roethlisberger is another guy who, drastic home road splits. So there are some questions there, but it's hard to say at the same time that everyone has their different style. Like no one's going to be Belichick, and a lot of guys have failed at trying to be Belichick. So not everyone's going to be able to be like that and be removed and just be this kind of stoic guy that's always focused on winning at all costs and doesn't really show much emotion. Like some guys are just going to lead differently in that, and it can work. It can work in different ways. We've seen a lot of different coaches win Super Bowls over the years. Just Belichick, Belichick's record before Tom Brady in the short time that he didn't have him with New England wasn't great, and his record in Cleveland wasn't great. So it's also a lot about the quarterback, and it's hard to kind of separate the two sometimes. So to answer your question, I think they're definitely there. I don't think he's overrated because he's had a lot of success, but I do think that he needs to be held accountable for a lot of the Steelers' letdowns that they have become kind of become a little too common over these past few years.
Yeah, well said. And I want to spend a little bit of time, not much, going into a lot of your research, the hard work. You are the hardest working person when it comes to fantasy sports I've ever seen in my life, Chris. I mean, you do your work. My God. Does injury play a part in your research? So I'm going to give you a guy that I love, but he's always hurt, so it's almost like it's not worth trading for him or drafting him. Jordan Reed, right? He's got all-world talent at that position. But you know what? He's always on. He's never. You'll never get even a half season out of him. So talk about that. How much does research play a part of your? How much does injury, play a part of your research? And does it? Are you weary of guys like Jordan Reed? I mean, I know the value concept. I get that. But I mean, even getting a guy late who maybe won't even put in a half season's got to be a little bit of a red flag.
All right, I'll answer the broader big picture injury question in a second, but I'll answer let's talk about Jordan Reed first, and I'll ask you a couple questions.
Okay.
Where was Jordan Reed going last year in fantasy drafts?
I want to say, if off the top of my head, I would say somewhere in the middle, somewhere in that 8 or 9 to.
He was going in the third round.
Wow! I didn't know that.
And where is he going this year?
If injury takes a toll, 6th, 7th.
He's actually going. His ADP now is you usually can get Jordan Reed in the 8th, 9th, 10th round. So that's what I'm getting at is that it's not about his injury risk as much as it is about where you're getting him, right? So you're getting, last year, and first of all, taking any tight end that early is a risk because think about it, like if you take a tight end in the third round and you think he's going to be a top 3 tight end, but for whatever reason, it doesn't pan out. Now, let's say he finishes as the tight end 15 because he gets hurt, misses a couple games, whatever. You've now dropped 15, 12 spots. You went from top 3 to 15. Whereas if you take a running back that doesn't pan out, and let's say you take him as the 12th running back or something like that, and you kind of were a little off, and he ends up as the 24th running back. Guess what? That's still a startable running back, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
There's just so much more margin for error with taking a tight end or a quarterback, and if you're starting one, that high in a draft, because there's kind of a floor where even if you whiff a little bit on a wide receiver or a running back, they're still usually usable. Like obviously, it's not ideal to whiff on an early pick, but it's going to happen. It does happen. So now that you can get Jordan Reed a little later on, he is one of my favorite values because I can get top 3 upside pretty much after I've stockpiled most of the time at running back and wide receiver. So love him this year. And in general, for injuries, they play a big part. I did research that kind of showed when a guy has a questionable tag, and at the time I did the research, we also had the probable tag, so it was a little more, we got actually a better picture, I think, of what was going on. But even guys who were on probable tags had a percentage decline in their play when they played after being on the injury report with a probable, and it was even more pronounced when you look at players who played through a questionable tag. So it does play a big role. There's a percentage decline. It was around like 15% for questionable tags when guys are playing through that. That doesn't mean every guy is going to have a bad game. It just means that you have to kind of lower the expectation of guys who are playing through an injury. And you could kind of dig a little deeper and look at the practice report, because guys who practice in full are obviously they're less likely to kind of be hindered than guys who are getting in limited practices or aren't practicing at all and then playing. So it definitely plays a big factor. But from a purely statistical level, there really is no correlation from year to year in injury risk. But you could kind of still kind of project it out just based on a player's history and the type of role they have. So running backs in general, they just miss more games on average every year than any other position. And so that's because they're, again, running into crowded situations where there's a lot of guys that could fall on them or fall into their legs or just, hit them really hard. And so you're going to kind of see running backs get hurt. And then, there's certain players that may just have a history. Like I get it with Jordan Reed, he gets another concussion or something, he might be done. But I mean, that's any player that could happen to any player. So when you look at it from a statistical level, there's no real correlation. There's no real such thing as quote unquote injury prone. But I mean, certain guys, it still makes sense. Like a Chris Thompson, another guy on the Redskins, it's like he's very small and he gets hurt a lot. And it's not surprising because he's very small. So you can kind of take it into account, but it's really just about the value, because what an injury will do is for Jordan Reed, it'll knock him down maybe 6 rounds in a draft. And all of a sudden he goes from a guy who is perhaps a little overvalued to a guy who's undervalued.
Yeah, really well said, Chris. And one of the things that a friend of mine in the league we talk about, is we feel like fantasy football, there's more luck involved. Not so much for somebody like you who does his research and homework.
There's still luck.
yeah, and there's luck certainly. Like, but if you compare it to like, I don't know, fantasy baseball, it's a little more. You have to be hands on every day. It's a little bit of a longer season. Does that drive you nuts? Like, if you're in a league where you do your homework, you look at trends, you look at everything. You're a big picture guy. Does it drive you nuts when you see somebody that just walks into the draft, and maybe you don't even have these people, because my league certainly does has people. I know people that don't do any research. They come in and they'll finish first or second, whereas some of us are pounding the pavement, getting our research down, listening to what you have to say, and doing subscribing to all the wonderful things you have. Man, help me through that. Help me through that.
That's the whole point. I mean, I would take it that a lot of people that are kind of listening to this stuff and subscribing and doing a lot of stuff are playing in more than one league. I'm sure you play in more than one, and so when you spend time on it, you understand that that's going to happen. I mean, that's part of it, and that's why I say do things like stock up on running backs, stock up on positions where it's going to be tougher to acquire somebody in the season, because you have to kind of account for that luck factor. I mean, even just something as simple as like, touchdowns fluctuate a lot from year to year. And it won't always be a rhyme or reason behind it. It's just sometimes a team gets in a certain position and a certain play call goes a certain way, and a guy scores a touchdown, and that's that. And if he scores, then the other teammates can't score. So, touchdowns year to year correlation is only like half as much as strong as it is for yardage and things like that. So you have to kind of be prepared for that, and that's just part of the game. But if you're playing in the more leagues you're playing in, your true skill level is going to shine through, and that's why I like DFS. It's because in DFS, it's really like you're playing hundreds of. Well, you can play like hundreds of leagues in a given weekend, and you're kind of getting a much better idea of your true skill level. So if you play in one fantasy league, I mean, realistically, if it's a 12-team league, what's that 8% chance by default that you have to win? Even if you're a really good, even if you're an expert, I mean, what do you at best? I mean, and this is really generous, but at best, what are you doing? Doubling those odds? So now you're at about a 16%. I mean,
right.
I mean, maybe I'm underestimating that, but if you're in a league with competent people, and even if you're like a super expert, I mean, doubling your odds is really significant. And so you still have to kind of be prepared for that. And that's why I say, and I just wrote about my personal story, kind of coming from where I did in the Bronx and kind of going through, going to school for accounting and kind of going into that career, not really enjoying it and kind of clawing my way out and getting into doing what I do now. And, one of the things I talked about was just, you're going to have to like make bets on yourself. And I think that's kind of how it goes. You have to be willing to take the risk. And you have to understand the risk. And it's the same thing in a fantasy league. It's like you start out with an 8% chance to win a 12-teamer or a 10% chance to win a 10-teamer or whatever. And your job is to just kind of, take some risks to raise that ceiling, because you're never really going to get to the point where, you're a 50% chance to win and the field is 50% when you're talking about, 11 other teams or 9 other teams. So, that's it's going to happen. But if you play in 10 leagues, you might win 2 or 3 because of your skill level is better than most, and that's kind of how you're approaching it. And then if you're playing for money, you're profiting that way because you have a lot of upside from winning those leagues. So the more leagues you play, the more your true skill level will come. If you're really bad at fantasy and you play a bunch of leagues, you'll probably lose a bunch more than you won't win any. But either way, as you increase the sample size, the true skill level will shine through more.
Yeah, it's funny that you say betting on yourself, because that's the direction I kind of wanted to go and end our interview in. You really have an interesting career and a life here, Chris. Every time I look at your resume, it seems like you're in a better place than you were the year before.
Oh, I never use resumes. I hope I never have to use a resume again. And this is coming from a person that, like, I was the guy in college and kind of just out of college that people would come to with their resume and be like, hey, can you edit this? Can you kind of hook this up? Like, I even help my dad with his resume. But I just hate resumes, man. Like, I hate them. I hope I never have to use one again.
All right, so I misspoke. Not resume. Your situation, right? So last year you're in a great situation. Mm-hmm. I look at you this year. My God, I mean, you're in a situation that is is in a seemingly better than you were the year before. You know, you're obsessed with stats. And, you know, Chris, my main job is I work with kids, right? And if I had $1 for every time they said, why do we need math? I want to give them your phone number, and I want to say, this guy probably has your dream job, because all kids all love fantasy sports, right? And you use math. I mean, it's probably a daily thing with you. I mean, it sounds very basic, but you know, you're the perfect example of that. You know, you're a 2009 Syracuse grad. You know, everyone in my league listens to you. They love you. I read your pinned tweet. It's what you're talking about. It's your life story. And my God, there was so many wonderful things to take away. You know, fantasy sports like you're working in is very much like podcasting, right? Everybody's in it. Everybody's an expert.
Oh, yeah.
But you know what, though? Not many bet on themselves. Not many dedicate their lives and are willing to take the risk. You could have easily been where you were last year, and that's a good place to be. But you said, you know what? You calculated the odds. You do the math. And my two favorite things that you said, okay, are personality does matter and be authentic. Because in my situation, you have podcasts very similar to this where people try to emulate this or emulate another one instead of being who they are. And it never comes across as organic. Chris, just talk about your life a little bit. I talked your ear off just now. You know, talk about everything I've been talking about, your life and math and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. And I'd love to hear your take on all that. Sure,
man. I mean, to be honest, there's always going to be some luck involved. Because I mean, So all right, I was a bad kid growing up. Like I was a bad kid that would always misbehave. But the catch was I would misbehave at home, but school came really easy to me. So I wasn't like your typical like gets in trouble, gets detention every day kid. I was more like your gets in trouble at home, gets in trouble after school. But in school, because it kind of came naturally to me. So like I know some people it's not as easy, but math was something that I always I kind of appreciate it for the way it teaches you to think. Like I'm not sitting here calculating complex math equations in my head. I use Excel or I use a calculator or whatever not. But I just think that thinking in mathematical terms, it's a lot more basic than I think. I think some people just get intimidated by math if they don't, kind of grasp it right away, because it can be intimidating. And there's a lot of the big problem, I think, with school in general, at least, and I obviously haven't been in school now for a while, graduated CUSE in 2009. But a big problem with school that I have seen is that, especially as a young kid, they don't really teach us the relevance of what we're learning. So it's really difficult to kind of learn algebra or trigonometry or whatever, calculus. I mean, I was bad in calculus, and I did not do well in calculus. And it's hard to learn those things when you have no idea when you will ever use them. And that's true of a lot of things we learn in school, history, a lot of the science we learn. It's just, and so a lot of times that kind of throws people off. And I guess I was just lucky to kind of stick with it and see kind of, because I got into sports at such a young age. I was, my grandpa had me watching football since even before I can remember. If you look at the picture in my pin tweet for my personal story, which you guys can find on actionnetwork.com as well. It's entitled Raybon, How I Quit My Accounting Job and Got Paid to Watch Sports. But it's, the picture is me with a game on TV next to me. And I talk about in the art, I don't even remember. So I was watching sports before I even remember. I was watching football, and I just kind of got into stats early, and that kind of helped me to stick with math, because it was just relevant to me, because it helped me kind of calculate these stats and, project these stats and understand these stats. And I was actually big into baseball stats too, because that's like, if you're a stat head, I mean, baseball had all the stats, now we're just getting all this great data from the NBA, and even less so the NFL. It's kind of lagging behind a little, but back in the day, I mean, you really only had baseball if you were like really into stats. So, that kind of helped. I think it's important to kind of think that way in terms of just, and nowadays I would say I use math more. Obviously I'm using it in my work, but more so just like probability, I think, is really big for me. Like there's always a lot of times people, like you said, it comes in with the authenticity. People feel like they have to give a strong take, or or they're not going to be valuable, or they feel like they have to act a certain way on a podcast, or they have to talk a certain way, or they have to write a certain way, where and feel and have a certain opinion, where it's like, no, it's like a lot of players that we talked about even today, it's like there's a range of outcomes, and it's just like more so, what is the probability of, what's the best outcome, what's the worst outcome, what's the probability of the best outcome, what's the probability of the worst outcome, and what's the probability of the most likely outcome. And if you kind of go by those fundamentals, and that kind of math, I mean, things kind of, I would say, clarify a little bit. At least for me, they do, in terms of how I think. So that was a big influence in my life. And then just like going back to just betting on yourself. I mean, I came out and I was going to school during the recession. It kind of just blindsided us. I mean, at the time I was, 19, 20. And, I didn't really know much about, I was taking a couple economics courses. I was in a business school, Whitman at Syracuse, studying accounting, but I didn't really know too much about what a recession meant at the time. I just knew that I was actually a psych major, and I just knew that if the economy was crashing, people probably, like, being like a therapist, and it's a really good, noble job, and it helps a lot of people, but it was just like, I didn't see the viability financially at the time, so I kind of just switched to accounting because it was something that I was good at in school. Like it just came easy to me, like maybe because of that same math background. So I did that, but then when I started working, just got bored essentially, and so figured out how to get out of that. And I talked about how when my first full-time job at 4 for 4. This was after I kind of had a couple lucky breaks, kind of sent the email to a website called Numberfire, and JJ Zacharyson, who actually goes by the name Late Round Quarterback on Twitter, Late Round QB, wrote a book on it and all that. He kind of happened to be the editor-in-chief there and responded, and I wrote for free. And that was something that I think was big for me, writing for free, because it kind of taught me the power of free content. Like a lot of people, I mean, I'm sure you put up your podcast is free, if I'm not mistaken. And so, yeah, so it's like the power of free content. Like there's so much saturation, as you mentioned earlier, that anyone has the means to do whatever they want now. So you can't just be out here trying to get try to collect on everything. What you have to do is think of it as an investment. Like, okay, if I do this free thing, if I give out this free content and grind and keep my day job, but I'm grinding an extra few hours every day or a few times a week on something I really want to do even more, then eventually that might pay off. And then not only will I be well compensated in that new area, because you always are going to do the best work at what you're good at, and you're going to get the most money for doing the best work, but you're gonna enjoy it. And so I think that was kind of a big thing, just kind of looking at that and saying, okay, well, I don't really like this accounting thing. Let me just kind of stick with this multiple streams of income. I learned that from Tim Ferriss, I think first, 4 Hour Work Week, really good author, really good podcaster. And so I just kind of took that to heart and just kept grinding. And eventually I got a full-time offer, but it was, I was technically taking a pay cut, because the way the deal was structured was that I had a certain amount of money I was getting paid, like, normal salary, but then I had incentives to where, we were creating a new product, and based on revenue and things like that, I would have, the ability to earn more based on that. So I had the potential to earn more than I was making at the time, but I was also taking a pay cut. And because this product, the DFS product at 4 for 4 at the time it didn't exist. We had to create it from scratch. We didn't know how it was going to do, how it was going to sell, or anything like that. So it was like a risk for me, because I could have just ended up taking a pay cut, like straight up, and it may have not paid off. But so that was like a risk I had to take. And then again, when I was in a good place with 4 for 4, wasn't really looking to leave or anything. And when the Action Network hit me up, my dude Chad Millman hit me up. He was a former guy from ESPN, kind of came over to the Action Network and has brought a ton of great talent on. Like I strongly encourage you guys to check out actionnetwork.com. Like just some of the talent we have writing, and we have like former athletes. We have just a lot of cool people that are writing for us, and very intelligent content. But he kind of was saying, hey, come over here, and again, it was kind of a situation where it was a bit of a risk, because and I should mention the 4 for 4 thing was a risk also, because DFS at the time was kind of questionable legality, and that's what I was really coming on to do, build the DFS product. So that was kind of a risk. And then at the same this whole thing with Action Network, we're a betting company first. We also own Fantasy Labs, which is a DFS company, and another company called Sports Insights, which is more like a lot of betting data. It's an awesome site as well. But our success, our upside was really tied to betting first, and we were successful before it got legalized. But I kind of knew that that was really what was going to put us over the edge. And at the time, I didn't really know if it was going to be legalized, and I didn't know I would be talking to kind of a new audience. Because everyone that kind of follows me knows me for more so strictly fantasy and DFS. And, I did a betting podcast last year with Warren Sharp, actually, but it was kind of betting and DFS focused. It wasn't just betting. So it was like a few risks there and kind of, kind of engaging a new audience. I started covering NBA a lot more and things like that. But at the same time, it still wasn't as big of a risk as the first time because just what they could offer and just the type of company that we're working with now. It was kind of like I say in my piece, it was kind of a no-brainer, but there was definitely some risk involved. You just have to be willing to take those risks. And a lot of people think, I have to quit my job before. You don't have to quit your job. Like I was grinding in accounting for like 2 years after I started writing. I wrote for free for a whole year, and I was still in accounting, and then I was grinding again, and then it wasn't until that third year that I was able to make the jump. So it's just more about what you prioritize. If you really want to kind of make a switch, a lot of times you can just keep your job and keep grinding and look for that opportunity to make that leap when it comes.
Oh my God, there's so much you said there that I totally agree with. And you were writing for that year, but you know what? You were pumping out quality, Chris, and it reminds me of, the guests that I get, I personally reach out for. I get awesome guests like you. I get wonderful actors. I reach out to these people. I get them to come on. They listen. It's quality content. And in the world of podcasting, unfortunately, there's cheap ways out. There's, you can pay for guests to come on your show, which I've never done. Other podcasters, they do that. They pay for, they take, there's a guest finding service where you pay people and they just give you random people to interview. Like, I couldn't come from a place like that. That's not organic to me. Like, when you were writing for a year, not getting paid, you were still passionate about your work. Like, I would love for somebody to take notice of the great things happening on a Monday Morning Critic, but if it doesn't happen, I'm still coming from a place of passion. I'm still going to pump out what I think is passionate work, the same way you did, man. There's so much that you said that I completely agree with, and you talked a little bit about your photo. There's one of you next to a TV. The other photo that I'm more jealous of was there's you opening a present, which I think is that electric football game with those. Oh my God, that's the one that got me jealous.
I was so hyped, and it was so bad. It was such a bad, it just didn't work. Like it was too many. Because I think what it was like, I think like a metal field. So for you guys that don't know, it's like this huge electric football game that probably is the size of almost like a beer pong table. And as a kid, it's just because remember, there's video games, but video games aren't that good back then. So it's like, this is like the mid 90s. The Madden guys are still skating around on the screen, and it's like, it's like 2D. So football video games are not good. So you're always kind of looking for that experience of kind of playing some football. And so I got this electrical football table game where it's supposed to have like, every player had his own player and you could everyone was supposed to be able to move around the board. And it was kind of just like, I think it was magnetically based, and it was just so bad. Like it just didn't work the way it was supposed to.
Your advice of betting on yourself and being yourself, man, that is, for those of you that haven't, please give Chris, it's Chris Raybon on Twitter. His story's a really wonderful one. And I don't care if it's not even about fantasy sports. It's about a man's life, and it's a very interesting read. Chris, before I let you go, I got one last question. I have put a bet in Vegas. Jacksonville to win the Super Bowl at 20-1. I put 500 on it. Bad bet or good bet?
I'm not mad at that. I think that's a good bet. I actually, just before I came on your podcast, was recording the I'll Take That Bet for today on ESPN Plus, and we just did we're doing NFL previews right now. So if you guys have the ESPN app, you can sign up for ESPN Plus and check out the show. But they'll be up for a while. Like they'll be up for a while because we're just talking about NFL win totals, and I was talking about the Jaguars and how I like them over their win total. I believe it's 8.5 or 9 games And I like the over on that because this is a team that, listen, they have a strong defense, top defense in DVOA. They lost Aaron Colvin at corner, but they still, so many talented players. When you talk about Ramsey, Bouye, Telvin Smith, Ngakoue, Malik Jackson, Calais Campbell, so many good players. And so you combine that with the fact that they have a good coaching staff now. Blake Bortles really, I think, took, kind of a step forward last year. People still like to kind of, make fun of him, but I mean, this guy was lights out for that first half of the AFC Championship game. This is a team that took the Patriots to the brink. Probably should have won the game. Had some bad play calling, I think, a little bit down the stretch that maybe was their undoing. But for the most part, I mean, this is a team that came within, a break of going to the Super Bowl. So I think that's not a bad bet at all. I mean, if something goes wrong with the Patriots, I think the Jaguars are one of those teams that I think you're looking at the Jaguars and the Steelers probably as those two teams that would be able to kind of go in their place. So I'm not mad at that bet at all.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in the heart of New England. I'm half hour to 45 minutes away from Gillette. But I got to be honest with you, Jacksonville should have been in the Super Bowl last year. I thought the Patriots got a couple lucky calls. I thought the Patriots were outplayed for a good 80 to 85% of that game.
Absolutely. I thought the same thing. I mean, Blake Bortles was impressive and for a lot of that game, and it just that happens, and then that's the mark of a good team, and that's why the Patriots are who they are, because they're never out of games. We saw that in the Super Bowl the year before. I mean, they didn't get it done this year, but that's also a testament to the Eagles and how good they were. So I think it's that the Patriots are always going to be the obstacle, but that's definitely a team that I think I'm looking to. I got some futures on the 49ers going to the Super Bowl just because I'm really high on Jimmy G, and I think when you have a quarterback, anything's possible. So I like their odds as well.
Well said. One last time, did you want to drop any of your social media info, any websites you want to promote? You've been dropping it along the way. I kind of want to give you a space just where people can just go and get it. Anything you want to promote here, Chris?
Sure. Follow me on Twitter at Chris Raybon. That's ChrisRaybon. You could check the pin tweet for the personal story we were talking about. Check out actionnetwork.com. Just browse it. I mean, we have a ton of free content on there. Subscription is $9.99 a month, but I mean, there's a ton of free content if you just want to check it out. Kind of see what we're about. And then I'll be doing my DFS work all season, like the stuff probably a lot of people are accustomed to me doing that I was doing at 4for4. I'll be doing that over at Fantasy Labs, which I mentioned is a company that Action Network owns as well. So I have my own model on there. We have the industry's best lineup optimizer. So check that out. And you can listen to me on the Action Network NFL podcast. Please subscribe if you like it. Please give it a rating, give it a review. Really appreciate it. But yeah, man, I appreciate all you guys listening, and I appreciate you for having me.